Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we are going to talk about the best and worst cards from the Call of the Mountain expansion. Yesterday we talked about Foundations and Rising Tides, so go back and watch that video if you haven't, and link will be in the description down below. But today we are going to focus just on Call of the Mountain, and the reason for that is you will see we have some very tough decisions, and I'm sure that this one will cause a lot of debate, particularly about the top cards in this expansion, because there is a lot of different cards that we could use. Now, a quick refresher of the rules that I went through in the last video. Number one, we are looking at the cards in their original form, so when they first came out. Any balance changes made after that we don't care about. We're just focusing on the initial form of the card. And rule number two is that there are no poros for the worst cards, and event cards are kind of a separate thing. So Aphelios, for instance, won't be in this this video, nor will the KDA cards either. They're kind of their own separate thing, and not part, or not officially part, of the Call of the Mountain expansion. So with that said, let's dive in to our top and bottom three cards from this expansion. So we will start with the worst cards and start with the honorable mentions like we did last time. So let's dive straight in, and the honorable mentions for the Call of the Mountain worst cards are Hunt the Weak, Fledgling Stellicorn, University of Piltover, and Wisefry. Just to quickly go over each one, Hunt the Weak, of course, whilst now it might be slightly better because there are cards that give you information about the opponent's hand, back then there really wasn't any of it, and of course the card only discards followers, and only the weakest followers at that. So yes, you do have the potential to get something very big and something very important, but at the same time you probably have just as much chance of hitting a complete dud, and paying 2 mana to kind of, maybe discard a 1 mana card, get minimal information. There's just better things to be doing with that 2 mana and that card slot. So Hunt the Weak just never really made that much sense, but maybe in the future it could. Fledgling Stellicorn, of course, is basically just a card that has a much better version of it coming out in the same set. Sparklefly, of course, is just a very good option and still is to this day, and, is potentially very strong to this day in Nami Zoe decks. So Fledgling Stellicorn basically is just kind of the worse older brother of Sparklefly in a way. The spell shield is not as important as elusive, and that's pretty much all there is to say. It just ended up being a much worse version of another card. University of Piltover was always a bit of a strange one, seemed always a bit like a meme card, discarding your entire hand for 3 random cards. Of course, could be good in theory sometimes if you had no hand, but overall was never really gonna make much sense, and given that there was already Jinx in the game, there was just much better things to be doing than having University of Piltover, which cost 1 more than Jinx. It just never really made any sense whatsoever, so ultimately it ended up surprisingly being a very bad card. And finally, Wisefry. Still to this day, it is kind of weird that this card has Vulnerable on it. This card, I'm just judging by the art and the kind of whole theme of it, I'm assuming it's like a Tom Kench card, and actually came out before Tom Kench. But what is going on with that card? Like, what are you meant to do with it? I just don't understand why it has Vulnerable. Like, it's just, there's plenty of... We have Alpha Wildclaw, we have 6 mana Overwhelm units already. Why does this one have Vulnerable? Why does it have to have this massive condition to be even, half decent? Why? What? There's a ton of things going on with this that is just like, but why? And the answer is, I don't know. So it ended up being, again, a pretty terrible card. And so, with the honorable mentions out of the way, let's move in to our top 3 worst cards of Call of the Mountain. Coming in at number 3 is Dusk Rider, a 5 mana, and it was a 2/5 back in the day. It eventually became a 3/5 with Fearsome, with Nightfall. Grant me 1 attack for each time we've activated Nightfall this game. So it's even trying to take credit for what you have done this game, trying to steal that away from you. But Dusk Rider, very bad. Of course, the comparisons came in straight away to Trifarian Shieldbreaker when this card came out. Basically, this card was a worse version of Trifarian Shieldbreaker for the most part. It needed a condition to get to the point. where Trifarian Shieldbreaker was, and that was already a pretty horrendous card to begin with, so you can understand that Duskrider came in as a very, very bad card in general, and even in Nightfall decks, even in the most all-in Nightfall decks, you still will never see a Duskrider, even after it got its buff. This was truly a horrendous card, and pretty much still is a horrendous card. The gaining of attack on a fearsome unit is just never really worth it. Sure, if it was Overwhelm, it would be a good card, it would make sense, but just on a fearsome unit, it's just not enough, and so Duskrider definitely deserving of the number 3 spot. Coming in at number 2 is Boomship, a 3-mana slow speed spell that deals 1 to a unit, then summons powder cakes equal to the amount of damage dealt. Obviously, this was a spell that was meant to synergize with kegs and, increasing the damage on the Boomship so that you could then summon a large amount of kegs as well. A good idea in theory, an interesting design in theory, but for some reason they decided to make this card slow speed, then also decided that it could only deal damage to units as well, and essentially we ended up with a horrendous card because those two things in combination just meant that this card could never really make any sense. There was always going to be better options than Boomship, more flexible options that didn't require going all in on kegs, that didn't require a bunch of things like only being at slow speed, needing kegs to deal more than dealing 1 to a unit, and you're paying 3 for that as well. This card has so many problems that have made it so bad, and everyone knew this card was just awful from the beginning, and it turned out to be true, and so that's why it rightfully so takes our number 2 place on this list. But then finally, at the number 1 spot is a card that we all expected, Sunk Cost. Of course, the memer's dream, Reddit's card of dreams. They love to talk about this card, and why it's so bad. And whilst it is very bad, at least this one does have a reason to be bad. It is an 8-mana slow speed spell. Place a unit or landmark into its deck. Now, this card obviously represents the landmark removal for Bilgewater, and I think it's pretty clear that the devs are trying to tell us Bilgewater is not meant to have good landmark removal, so they got this card. Now, placing a unit or landmark into an opponent's deck actually is a very good thing most of the time because, it foregoes any last breath effects or anything like that. You could use this on an Anivia or a Commander Ledros, and it actually would be quite a good thing. But obviously being 8 mana and being slow speed just completely killed this card 100%. And also, for landmark removal, if this is your landmark removal that you're trying to use, I don't even think there is a landmark that costs more than 8, although maybe I'm wrong. But certainly there wasn't at the time, and so it doesn't make any sense. Sunk Cost, just a horrendous card, and unless it changes speed, I think it probably will always be a pretty bad card. But now we'll move on to the top cards in Call of the Mountain, and this is why we're here really, because this is the really hard decision. And so what I'm going to do is a bit different. I'm going to list all the cards that I considered to be on this top 3 list, and then we're going to select them out of that group. And you'll see what I mean when it is a really tough decision between a lot of good options. So let's list all the candidates first, and then we'll start diving in and talking about how I eventually came to make my decision. So here are all the options that I chose from, and it's quite the list. So in no particular order, here they are: Trundle, Ballistic Bot, Pale Cascade, Sharpsight, Troll Chant, Hush, Stalking Shadows, Grand Plaza, and Doom Beast. Now, there are some absolutely monstrous cards on that list, and whilst today some of them have fallen off because they have been nerfed, in fact, quite a lot of these cards have been nerfed, at the time of them coming out, their initial designs, they were absolutely meta staples, some of them even meta dominant staples, completely warping the meta around them, and so I had a very tricky time deciding which ones exactly were the best and which ones, maybe were slightly underneath that. We can see on the list here that quite a few of them have changed, from their original forms, but let's just go through the list and talk about why they were so good. Trundle, of course, a 4/6 with regeneration. I would be surprised if we ever saw that again, because Trundle just absolutely dominated the early phases of the game, because it felt like basically no 5-drop that was being played could actually trade into Trundle. Something about having that 6 health on turn 5 just meant that you couldn't really attack with any of your units, because Trundle would just take the hit and then live, and then he'd be fine, and then you'd lose. That's what it felt like you couldn't let the game get to turn 5, and if your opponent was playing ramp decks, like they often were with these Trundle decks coming out, then it would be even worse, that Trundle would come down on turn 4, and then you'd be in an even worse position, because now you've just got this card that's just going to sit there for the rest of the game, and you can't even attack. So Trundle definitely deserving a place in and around this list. But we move on to Ballistic Bot, who is one of the few that hasn't changed on this list. Ballistic Bot, of course, has always been just a great card generator, giving you that free ignition every turn, getting an extra attack pretty much every turn, just great for discard and things like that, just giving you a lot of steam. I think Ballistic Bot really enabled the kind of, Draven, Piltover, and Zorn decks that have been going around for a while now. He was really the start of it, was Ballistic Bot, because you just had that constant generation of cards, just a very, very strong card in general that could be used in a lot of different ways, and saw a lot of play in a lot of different decks. Pale Cascade obviously needs no introduction. The card was absolutely dominant for a long, long time, eventually receiving a nerf, but still sees a lot of play in pretty much every Targon deck, because it's still just that good. Having a combat trick that draws you a card with a fairly easy condition to get, it's a really, really, really good thing in Legends of Runeterra, and so it's no surprise that the card dominated, and even after the nerf is still a very, very strong card, and is still seen in a lot of decks. The next two we can kind of combine into one, Sharpsight and Troll Chant, both 2-mana combat tricks that actually are some of the ones that haven't been changed on this list, but many people probably think that maybe they might need to be changed, or one day might be changed, particularly Sharpsight today, because Demacia is becoming more prevalent, but I think the same would be said if Freljord ever became very prevalent as well. So both of them could be changed in the future, and they both just are very, very strong combat tricks that you always have to play around, and pretty much are auto-includes in most decks in their respective regions, so it's no surprise that they make it onto this list. Next up is Hush, which absolutely ruined a lot of games early on when it first came out. Hush actually received 2 changes after being a 3-mana card that created a fleeting copy of itself every time you played it. They eventually turned it into the 2-mana version of Hush that we have now, but obviously at 2-mana it was still too strong, so eventually they made it the 3-mana version we have today. But the initial version was particularly toxic, because once you would silence that unit of your opponent could potentially respond with a combat trick, right? But actually they couldn't, because then you could just use the fleeting Hush that you gained, that would then give you another one if you wanted, and just continue that cycle. And so because your opponent was committing a card, and you kind of weren't committing a card because you got that for free, it meant that your opponent was always at a bit of a disadvantage anytime they tried to re-up their card with a combat trick, making potentially a lot of their cards in their hand completely useless against Hush. This created a situation where Hush was dominating games early on and had to be changed, as I say, twice, not even once, but twice, to find a healthy place for it, and even some today would probably say that they aren't the biggest fan of Hush or Silence in general, so it was a very frustrating, very powerful card from the Targon expansion. Next up, we have Stalking Shadows, which, was just premier card draw, like absolutely top tier card draw for a lot of different decks in Shadow Isles, and honestly probably enabled Shadow Isles to stay as that kind of meta-defining region for a very long time. Shadow Isles has always been good, but I think the addition of Stalking Shadows really kept Shadow Isles at the top, and as we've seen since the Stalking Shadows nerf, Shadow Isles for the first time has really started to dip, potentially for the first time ever in this game's history. And so I think that just goes to show that Stalking Shadows as a card was really, really helping Shadow Isles stay towards the top in terms of region dominance throughout this entire game's history. Then we have the Grand Plaza, which of course when it first came out completely warped the meta around it, perhaps like no other card on this list. Pretty much if you weren't playing a Grand Plaza deck, you weren't playing to win at that point in the game. Plaza decks completely dominated. The extra health and the challenger just meant that essentially all your units were going to live and you were just going to get free kills. And particularly combined with Scout, it was an absolutely nasty, 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 nasty thing to put on any card. What made it even worse was that oftentimes it felt like if your opponent played Grand Plaza on turn 3, then they would win. But if they didn't play on turn 3, or if they couldn't find the card, then you would win. That's often what it felt like it came down to. Just this one card, you know, people would just mulligan their entire hands, no matter what it was, to just find Grand Plaza. That's the only card they need. They just need a one-off Grand Plaza, and the rest will sort itself out. That's how powerful this card was, and it completely warped the meta around it. And so I think it's definitely deserving up with these cards. And last but not least, we have Doom Beast, which again, probably alongside Stalking Shadows, and particularly in combination with Stalking Shadows, created that ability for Shadow Owls to just dominate the meta for a very long time in one way or another. Because Doom Beast and the 4 health life swing, particularly as I said, offers Stalking Shadows, which then could give you a potential 8 life swing between the two players, was just really, really strong. And putting that on a 3-2 body, again with a pretty easy condition to activate like Nightfall, just turned it into a really, really, really strong card that still sees play to this day. This card has not been nerfed. It's one of the ones that hasn't been on this list, but again is probably one of those cards that maybe one day will be nerfed, particularly if, you know, we see the return of Stalking Shadows coming back and maybe some other things that could help Doom Beast in the future. But just a very, very strong card that's seen a lot of play in a lot of different decks. And so that leaves me with the decision. Which of these cards do I put into the top 3 out of all of these options? It is nearly impossible because so many of them are so strong, and at one point or another I'm sure they have all been considered for a different nerf. So it's very, very tricky to try and separate these cards, because knowing what I do now from when I did, you know, when we were actually playing with these cards, I perhaps didn't realize just how strong some of them really were. And I'm sure that if we could go back in time, you know, we could probably refine a deck or two that would just, you know, really just prove how strong some of these cards actually were. But with that said, I do have a top 3 for this list, so let's dive into it. Coming in at number 3 is Hush. Now, Hush probably is a card today that people would be maybe a bit surprised about, because Hush has now for a time existed in a relatively okay place. But I should not underestimate just how strong and just how toxic this card was when it first came out. I remember people talking about, as you know, the card was revealed, that this card was going to be the biggest problem Runeterra had ever seen, and it actually came true. Unlike a lot of, you know, other prophecies of doom, you know, the Hush one actually kind of was true, because there were a lot of games that were just ruined by the fact your opponent had one card in hand, and it felt like there was nothing you could really do about it. It was unfun to play against, but it was also just super, super strong. It was just like premier removal. It was like the anti-commitment to anything. You could never just commit anything to your units. You could never go all in on a strategy, because Hush existed and it was coming for you. And even if you tried then to, you know, undo the first Hush, the second Hush was just right there for you as well. And so it felt like you couldn't really do anything about it. And so that's why Hush definitely deserves a top 3 place on this list. Perhaps one of the most toxic cards of all time, but also was just super strong at the same time. At number 2, let's go for the Grand Plaza. Obviously today, the Plaza isn't quite what it once was with its old form of just giving that extra health. Just goes to show how much a health change can make a difference. Not that the Grand Plaza is like a bad card in my opinion at this point, but that one health really did just completely change everything, and it completely warped the game around it, as I said before. And so I don't see how I couldn't put this card on the list, because it was just all encompassing about the Grand Plaza. Everything was there, and the landmark removal maybe wasn't, you know, people weren't really running much landmark removal in those days. People weren't perhaps figuring out what the best way of doing that was. But the Grand Plaza was just an absolute menace in every single way, and so I have no problems with putting it this high on the list. And I honestly really did consider about putting it number 1 on the list, because it was just so strong. and, as I say, warp the meta around it and just completely change the game. But at number 1, I have Pale Cascade, which I truly believe has a strong case to be the strongest card that we have ever seen in this game. Pale Cascade was just so good at everything. And again, just one little stat change might not feel like a lot, but as I say, Pale Cascade is still a very good card, and so with that extra stat on a combat trick, it's just such a big change. You cannot underestimate how big of a change it is. And the card was just nuts, you know, people were running Allegiance decks with Pale Cascade as their only splash, and often if people were running Allegiance decks, Pale Cascade was the only choice, only good choice for a splash card, because pretty much every deck would want this card if they could get it. And so any Allegiance deck would just auto-run 3 of Pale Cascade. It was an insane card for so many situations. The free draw, it was just everything about this card was just so good in every single way. And, you know, because it's a combat trick, it probably goes slightly under the radar, right? You don't feel the impact of it as much as perhaps you would at Grand Plaza, where you can clearly see they've won this game because of Grand Plaza. Pale Cascade would win a lot of games, but kind of go under the radar doing it. But given that, most people actually would probably recognize that Pale Cascade was a very strong card. And so, because basically this card, you know, it's kind of one of those cards that's meant to go under the radar, but still didn't because so many people recognized that this card was absolutely busted. That should just tell you just how absolutely crazy this card was, and the fact that it really did need a nerf. Oh, this card, I don't miss it. I don't miss the old Pale Cascade one bit. And so I think it's very deserving that it gets the number 1 spot on our list for the Call of the Mountain expansion. But this one was very tricky, and I'm sure that people could order them in a lot of different ways, because a lot of those cards that I mentioned were very strong indeed. And so I'd be very interested to see what ordering you would have for those cards, because it's a very tricky decision overall. And so, with that said, this ends the second episode of the best and worst cards from each expansion. I hope you understand why Call of the Mountain kind of needed to be its own thing, because it just had so many cards that could have been at the top of the list, and I think it was just an absolutely crazy decision, and I was really stuck for a long time figuring out, you know, well, is this card better than this one? Oh, but this card was really good for a time. You know, it was just an absolute complete mind cluster for me to try and figure out which one of these cards would end up at the number 1 spot. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. I'd really like to know what you would put as your top cards, and as I say, tomorrow there will be the 3rd video on this, where we go through the Empire's Ascended expansion and what we have so far of Beyond the Bandlewood as well. So don't miss that one. Hopefully it'll be easier than this one. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a really nice day.